To say that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a big deal is the epitome of an understatement. Aside from the overall entertainment from the films, the major draw is, of course, certainly the characters. And now you have people that know who Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, Black Panther, Ant-Man, and Black Widow are, who have never picked up a single comic book in their life. Now they could like the actor or the performance, but ultimately I think the thing that draws them back every time is the character and their journey. And for a complete picture, you have to look at the characters whose popularity predate the MCU. Those characters did have adaptations of their stories. Characters such as Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, X-Men, and Blade. So why look back to their past? That's because history itself has its own story to tell. It's about the rising and falling of characters, or at least their popularity, and about how some things that are seemingly commonplace now just weren't true back then. For example, what if I told you that the Avengers weren't always popular and weren't household names? Oh, you like the X-Men, do you? Well, bullshit. If it was the 1960s, you'd be like, who are these freaks? I got better stories to read. I can already hear the frustrated cries of casual viewers saying, no, I love the X-Men. They've always been popular. You know, Wolverine, the movies. Well, case in point, we need to go back in time to the characters' origins. So come with me on a journey that involves charts. Because I made some charts. I'm Zack Bishop, and this is a story about Marvel popularity and how it's changed over time. And just so I don't receive a bunch of angry comments telling me how wrong and stupid I am, that might happen anyway, but this is 100% based on other opinions and data that I've looked up, as well as my own opinion. In fact, I kind of want you to correct me if there's anything wrong. I'm completely open to learning new information, especially if it's about characters that I find interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So go ahead and leave any info in the comment section that I might have missed. Since I'm trying to keep this positive, let's start with some positive news. Spider-Man. Guess what? He's always been popular. As you can see by the chart here, old Webhead has always been kind of a big deal. People love this guy. Arguably, Spider-Man is one of the most popular characters in the world, and has been for like 60 years. And in those early days, in the 60s and 70s, they really cemented him into the cultural realm. His first appearance was in Amazing Fantasy number 15, all the way back from 1962, and he's been going strong ever since. And as he swung on into the future, the 1980s, I put a slight dip here because some fans were very vocally outraged by the change in his costume. For a while, 1984 to 1988, Spider-Man wore a black costume, the original being the symbiote that he got from 1984's Secret Wars. Although now most people like the costume and like what it's associated with, back then it was a big deal, as well as some of the changes that happened to Pete in the 80s, which personally I find fascinating and kind of want to read about it now. During this time period, Peter Parker was older. He had already graduated from high school, and he was friends with a detective, Jane DeWolf, who was sadly killed in 1985. As I said, he wore the black costume, which would later result in Venom. And probably the most important change during this time period was that he finally married Mary Jane Watson in September of 1987. Wait a minute. That's when I was born. Oh my god. Is Spider-Man and Mary Jane my real parents? Mom, Dad, why? Still following along on the chart, you can see in the 90s it dipped even lower. And why is that? The Clone Saga. That's why. It's a bunch of nonsense. Nonsense in a comic book. Do you know how hard that should be to achieve? Despite those odds, they somehow managed to piss off people for 2 years, from 1994 to 1996. After that, the movies came and Spider-Man was back on top again. So then when the MCU came into existence in 2008, some people were already speculating, well hey, what about Spider-Man? Is he gonna be in there? But then many learned the sad truth that Sony owned the film rights. But then again, Marvel Studios knew how important he was for the money. I mean story. No, I mean money. And he's been making them that money ever since Captain America Civil War, where he first appeared and started spinning a web of love and money. Some will say the Fantastic Four suck. And that's because those 3 films that came out suck. But the Marvel Universe took the shape that we all know and love back in 1961 thanks to Marvel's first family, with Fantastic Four #1. And back then, they were popular. And they stayed that way, at least for a little while. And since their debut, Marvel started pushing out more interesting heroes to keep the momentum going, and they took less of a center stage due to that, at least in part. They were declining in the 70s, but they were saved briefly by writer John Byrne. But unfortunately, they slid further down thanks to changing writers and artists so often. And by 1996, they were cancelled for Heroes Reborn. A fate worse than death. Years later, in 2005 and 2007, we received 2 Fantastic Four movies. They were not good. Then a reboot in 2015 to hilariously bad reception. But as Disney finally acquired Fox, fans of the Four knew that they would eventually get something decent in the way of a film. And besides, 4th time's the charm. No, I'm not counting that unreleased Fantastic Four movie by Roger Corman. It wasn't meant to be, and this is. Next we have the X-Men, a group of mutants whose powers are as vast and varied and their lives are soapier than the soapiest of soap operas. Strangely enough, in September of 1963, both X-Men #1 and Avengers #1 came out. But then as time went on, the X-Men sold less and less. And despite always believing that they were cancelled, they weren't actually cancelled. By 1970, with issue number 66, the writers at Marvel decided to stop writing new stories and just reprint old ones, going all the way up to issue number 94. And that went on until 1975, when Chris Claremont wrote Giant Size X-Men #1, and shit went off. People loved the new team, but not Wolverine. They still liked Cyclops, because Cyclops was actually cool back then. They liked Storm and Colossus and Nightcrawler. And who wouldn't? They're awesome. So then by the 1980s, the Dark Phoenix saga went off. Shit just kept popping off. Can't stop, won't stop. Then, after writing the X-Men for so long, Chris Claremont teamed up with artist and co-plotter Jim Lee to put out X-Men #1 in October of 1991. And that became the best-selling comic of all time. Then 9 years later, in 2000, the very first X-Men film came out and boosted their popularity to new heights, especially for people who weren't all X'd out by then from the comics, because there was like a million X titles in the 90s. But unfortunately, as their movies kept coming out, the more and more people disliked them. This small slip in popularity, or at least in the popularity of their films, came due to a poor handling of the source material. But that hype train is once again on course, because people eagerly await their arrival in the MCU. And once they do arrive in the MCU, it will confirm once again that the X-Men just can't be held down. They can't be stopped. Like a phoenix, they'll always rise again. As I said earlier, in September of 1963, there came a day unlike any other, when Earth's mightiest heroes were assembled for the first time. And it was okay, I guess. People liked it, but not a huge deal. But one thing that really stuck out about it was taking a group of established heroes and putting them together as a team. But despite that, it wasn't the mind-blowing spectacle that people think of today when they think of the Avengers. And for the sake of this video, even when I say that the Avengers weren't that popular, they still had their loyal fans. And it actually grew more in the 70s as the roster grew and changed. Aside from that, they had events like the Kree-Skrull War that they fought in, as well as the Korvac saga, in which every damn Avenger around at the time was in it. And again, this next little dip here in the 80s is more from other titles doing well. The other characters around them were very popular, so it seemed that they paled in comparison. With the likes of Spider-Man and the X-Men going very strong, the Avengers took a back seat to them. But as the decade went on, they added even more characters, and around 1987, they came out with the excellent story, Avengers Under Siege. Hey, September 87. There's some kind of pattern here? No, there's not. Only charts. Then came the 90s, in which the roster was very different at that point, and they wore bomber jackets over their uniforms, which I believe was an attempt to feel more like uniforms, like with the X-Men, because the X-Men were popular. But what doesn't make sense about that is the X-Men didn't really have uniforms at that time. So, what was the point? Then after that, Heroes Reborn happened, so that sucked. And then Heroes Return happened, so they came back. And then in 1998, during that time period, they had a string of hit stories thanks to writer Kurt Busiek and artist George Perez. This upward momentum pushed them to new heights. Then, in 2008, Iron Man started the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And since that time, the Avengers have grown in so much popularity that they are now household names. And just to really hammer in this point that I've made through the entire video, let's look at one last chart to really make sure we got it covered. So during the 60s and 70s, I wasn't alive, and people enjoyed that very much. Then in 1987, I was born, and I was merely tolerated. Then in the 90s, I was a little bit more popular, probably thanks to my comic books and video games and such. But of course after that, once again, I was merely just tolerated. But of course, once I get into the MCU myself, I will be liked just enough for you to like, share, and subscribe, and join my Patreon at patreon/TheBisness. At the very least, you could allow me to live just a little bit. Thank you for watching. I'm Zack Bishop. Excelsior, 'cause I'm a goddamn half nerd.